unseen realm and how this applies to the book of Colossians. Look what it says here. God has taken his place in... Oh, no problem. Is the eardrums all right? Good evening, everybody. It's a great honor to speak to the well-known Peachtree City congregation in Georgia. Thank you for having me once again for your summer series. It was a great honor to speak for you numerous times while Aubrey Johnson was the minister. It was a great honor to speak at a men's retreat as well as for the congregation. So it's good to be back, even though I am back virtually. So greetings from Castle Rock, Colorado, where we are recording this. But it's a great honor to be at your congregation, even through the screen this evening. Thank you, Stan, for the gracious opportunity to be on the summer series. Stan is one of the most well-known and recognizable ministers in our brotherhood. He is incredibly talented, and I know you guys are blessed to have him. So thank you so much for Stan for having me and giving me this opportunity. If you look at this verse in Psalms 82, verse 1, I believe it will set the context for the overview of the book of Colossians and what Paul is trying to do in this ancient Greco-Roman city. Look at what it says here in Psalms 82, verse 1, and look at what it's saying in reference to the term Elohim. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. God, Elohim, stands in the divine assembly. He administers judgment in the midst of the gods. Elohim. Now, you know that the term Elohim is used for Yahweh, the Lord. But in this context here, you have God, Yahweh, in the midst of this divine assembly, divine council, and he is executing judgment upon them, these other gods, Elohim. A lot of times in America, we look at the unseen realm through very Western eyes. But if we were to look at it through the Greco-Roman culture, even going back to the Old Testament world, the way we would view the unseen experience would be completely radically changed from how we do. You have the term Elohim here, and it is in reference to Yahweh, the Lord. But then you also have this divine assembly, these divine council members who are also called Elohim, but they are not God in the sense of Yahweh. They are lowercase gods. And you look at this, and if you are coming from Greek mythology, if you are coming from a pagan background, they would look at this and think, okay, God is in this assembly or this pantheon. But that is not what's happening here in this context. There is more to this unseen realm that we typically do not view as Western Christians. And their understanding of divine entities would be different than how we would view it today. When we look at the book of Colossians, we see it through an American perspective. But we need to go back to look at it through the eyes of somebody who is Roman or a Greek, and somebody who does not come from Western Christianity. So I wanted to look at this verse because it kind of causes us to question, what is this verse talking about? This verse is not talking about some type of paganism, but it's talking about God is superior. He is better than these other Elohim in this divine council. He is superior. This is what Colossians is doing in this letter that Paul writes to them. The reason we kind of do this is because we have filters in our minds. We have numerous filters that when we hear something that we don't really understand, instead of looking at it through new eyes, we usually filter it through our own paradigm and our own perspective. And in the church, we kind of filter it through Western Christianity. So when you have this verse about the divine council, we sit back and think it must be angels, but it's probably not angels. We think it's a Jewish rulers, but it's probably not Jewish rulers. So who could it be? But there's probably more to the divine spiritual realities than we usually give ourselves credit for. But we have been passed down Christianity from the Roman church through Western philosophy, and we have removed a lot of the spiritual realities before our eyes that we just simply overlook because we look at it through the filters in our Bible. Think about when someone talks to you about maybe a spiritual experience that they had. Sometimes it almost feels like we're looking for how it could not happen that way. But I think if we could open our eyes up to that God is superior, that God created all things, that we would allow more preeminence to God than we have typically given him. So in the book of Colossians, you have this fight that's taking place here. That to understand Colossians and the tension within the book, we need to think like Paul and we need to think like Romans. We need a Greco-Roman worldview and the Jewish writer's perspective. We read a book like this in America, and like most Christians, we see it, but we have almost completely in our minds, made up our minds, Jesus is preeminent. Nobody in our churches are sitting back and think, well, I don't know. Maybe the Hindu gods are better than Jesus, or maybe the Buddhism is better. That's typically not how we view it, because we have had our minds settled on the truth a long time ago. But in Paul's audience, that is not the case. Here you have these Greco-Romans, and you have all these temples all around them. You have these massive buildings built to honor the gods that a lot of the people in that time serve. And so when Paul comes along and says that Jesus is preeminent, that Jesus is above Caesar, that Jesus is above Zeus, they sit back and think, how can that be? You have these massive temples built in the honor of these gods, and you have this Jewish fisherman who is being proclaimed by Paul to be preeminent over all of these lowercase g gods. It just doesn't make sense if you're coming from that perspective in your life. Now, a lot of them as well, though, the temptation isn't that they reject Jesus outright. They're not saying that Jesus is not a God. They would be perfectly happy to include Jesus in this pantheon of gods. But Paul doesn't say you can do that. As Christians, there is only one God, Yahweh, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. And you can't just bring Jesus in, build him an altar, and then worship him alongside the other gods of the Greco-Roman world. Paul is saying our loyalty is to Jesus and Jesus only. And his case is in the book of Colossians, because he is the firstborn son of Yahweh, coming from the Jewish background. He is the fullness of deity. And so all of these other gods that they would consider to be real, unlike us in Western Christianity, we don't sit back and think, oh yeah, Zeus, these other gods of their world are real. For them, it's perfectly true that you would have Jesus and these other gods. And so Paul wants to dethrone the other gods and exalt Jesus Christ in the book of Colossians. Until we take our minds out of Western American Christianity and place ourselves back into the Greco-Roman world, we're not going to understand the book of Colossians in the way it was originally meant by Paul. I could go over the entirety of the book, but I really want to just focus on the thematic verses of Colossians. And I believe this is what is original and unique to the book of Colossians. And so we're going to look at this context here. Look what it says in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 to 20. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So Paul is talking very clearly here in this section that Christ is sufficient in all that he does, and it highlights the supremacy of Jesus, the Son of God, and through him there is restoration and redemption. This is maybe, perhaps, as some scholars say, maybe it is an original or an early hymn that the early Christians would sing, but this was their theology, that Jesus was created in heaven and on earth. He is over everything that is visible, invisible, whether thrones or dominions and rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. Now think about it from a Greco-Roman perspective. If you hear this in America, you say, yeah, of course, Jesus created all things. He was there in the beginning in Genesis, and he was part of the Trinity. But step outside of what you have been taught by Western Christianity and think about it from the perspective of a Greco-Roman. When you would hear this, you would not hear just, of course, he is the creator. They would hear, he has created Zeus. He has created Caesar. That's a radical shift. It's not just Paul is saying that Jesus is above them. He is saying that Jesus has made them. So who is significant and who should have our loyalty? It would be Jesus. Unlike the Elohim in Psalm 82 of the divine council, Jesus is eternal. He was not created, but he is the creator. This is what he says here in Colossians 1, 15 to 16. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the image of Yahweh, the firstborn of all creation. Now, the term there, firstborn, is not that in the sense that he is a created being, but it is the sense of hierarchy. It's the same idea in classic Jewish literature and found in the Bible, that the term firstborn is the one that has preeminence, that he is the firstborn son in the family. Therefore, the birthright will be passed through him. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. He is exalting Jesus, and he's saying that he is the perfect image of God himself. This idea of image comes from our concept of icon. That he is the imago Dei of God, that he is the perfect representation of Yahweh himself. So if you see Jesus and his conduct and his character, by his behavior, it is perfectly in line with the behavior of God himself. If you look at Colossians 3:10, look at this description here. The new man that is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. That we are the image bearers of God, but Jesus is the perfect image bearer of the Lord. That he is perfectly synonymous with God himself. I remember in 2018, Charity, my wife, decided that she would like to have a really nice camera. So I called up a friend who knows something about cameras, and I asked her to give me some recommendations about what would be the best camera to buy her. That was also affordable, because cameras can be very expensive. Now, what's interesting, we have had this camera since 2018. I'm not sure how much Charity has used it, but my daughter, Gabrielle, who has taken photography numerous times in her school, uses it all the time. But if you look at a camera, what is a camera to do? A camera is to take an icon, and you'll notice what it's called, Nikon. So essentially, it's the idea of icon. It takes the representation or image of that which is in front of you. And the high quality cameras, because of their lenses and their technology, are able to capture that image better than a cheap camera. If you look at some of the early digital cameras, they would be blurry because their pixels were not that high and their lenses were not as clear. But as camera technology has increased, its ability to capture the essence and the true image of what is before it has increased. Jesus is the Nikon, the icon of God, and he perfectly captures the image of Yahweh himself. That's what Paul is saying in those verses. Now, if we continue in Colossians chapter 1, verse 17 to 18, it says this: "And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent." Now, in verse 17, it is extolling Christ even farther. So it continues to ramp up praise to Jesus, demonstrating his superiority and sustaining power, his pre-existence in the sense that he holds all things together. The eternal Son has not only created all things, he also keeps all things working. So think about this once again from this Greco-Roman perspective. They are constantly struggling in that society with loyalty to the gods. Because if you had the God of the harvest and the God of the sea and the God of weather, you would have these gods all competing with one another, and you never knew where you stood because of polytheism. You may be sitting well with one God, but another God may be angry with you. You had no security and you had no confidence in the future because you were constantly concerned with offending the gods. But Paul is saying if we are loyal to Christ, we don't have to worry about these other small g gods because we are loyal to the big G God, Jesus. And he is the one that is holding this all together. It's not the pagan gods of the Romans or the Greeks or the other cultures and civilizations at that time. These gods only brought chaos, and that is a radical shift. A lot of the gods that they viewed and they worshipped in Rome actually were more executors of chaos. They caused more problems than they actually created good. But with Jesus, he holds all things together. He is a binding force that brings control to chaos. And so they are hearing this and they're sitting back thinking, why would I be loyal to my pagan gods, these gods of the temples? Because I can't have any security and I can't have any trust. But if you are loyal to Jesus, he holds all things together. He binds all things as one. And then he goes into how he is the head of the body, the firstborn of the dead. That he is sovereign over creation. He's also sovereign over death. That he controls both powers. He is the founder of new humanity. And he is the firstborn from the dead. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20. He is the one that has defeated death. In the church of Colossae, this is pushing back to a philosophy that was quite common called Gnosticism. Gnosticism crept into the church and was trying to marginalize Christ. It was a combination of mysticism, Jewish legalism, and Greek philosophy. The heresy taught that Christ could not be God. This belief was based on Greek philosophy, which taught the spirit was good and the body was evil. Therefore, God could not have become human because God cannot mix with evil, and they saw the body as evil. It also taught Jesus was an angel and that receiving him was not good enough for salvation. One needed a new revelation to be saved. That is where the name Gnostic comes from. The Greek word gnoskaios means to know in order to be saved. One needed secret knowledge that only the Gnostics had experienced. The heresy attacked the very foundation of the gospel because it attacked Jesus at his core. You still see some of this in some of the religious movements in America where they do not completely embrace the pre-existence and divinity and deity of Christ. Where some of these religious movements will say that Jesus was born a man and a man only who became a God, and some other groups will say that he was a created being and that he was not always God, but he was declared to be God. But Paul is very clear. Jesus is God. He always has been and always was. He is pre-existing and he is preeminent. Notice what he says here in the verse. Let me go back. Let me illustrate it this way. When I was in high school, I played baseball. And on our provincial team, it would be the equivalent of our team that went to states or went to provincial championship. We ended up playing different teams all over the province. And we ended up winning the state baseball championship when I was in high school. I believe I was a senior. Now, I played second base and rode plenty of bench. So it certainly wasn't because I was preeminent or that great. But we had this one player named Luke, and Luke in Nova Scotia, and the quality of baseball in Nova Scotia is not very high. He actually played on Canada's national junior team. So you have all the players across the country of Canada in the big cities of Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. But this kid grew up in the valley and played in our small kind of town, played on our team, and the kid was phenomenal. He was the best kid in the entire province by far. So if we wanted to win a game, all we had to do is have him play. He would pitch, and you could almost guarantee he was going to hit a run in or hit a home run. The kid was amazing. So all of us could be pretty bad, but Luke was preeminent. He was the one has given us the championship. It wasn't because of us. It was because of him. Paul is saying here in the letter of Colossians that Jesus is the star. Jesus is the one that gives the victory. Jesus is the one who has defeated death. It's not us. It's not these other Roman gods. It's Jesus and Jesus only. He continues to make his case, once again, for the preeminence of Jesus in Colossians chapter 1, verse 19 to 20. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross. So Paul is saying that God reconciles man through Jesus, and Christ is the agent of reconciliation. And we need to be reconciled to Christ, but he does this through the peacemaking because of his work on the cross. That the Father is equal to Jesus, and Jesus is equal to the Father because the fullness of God dwelt in him. That he was the incarnated Son. And he, in contrast to the Gnosticism that we see in Colossians, where they would say you had these demigods, so you would have Yahweh, and then the next level down you would have, a God that is not as good. And then down it would go to somebody like Jesus who could take on some flesh but also have some spirit. They would have this hierarchy of gods. And Paul's saying that is not the case. That the complete fullness of the God head is in Jesus Christ. That he is fully God and he is fully man. And because of this, this is why we can have reconciliation with God, because of what he has done for us. He made peace between man and God, which is something that you never saw in the Greco-Roman world. If you read their stories and their literature, their gods are constantly having conflict with humans. They are constantly involved in this type of rivalry with one another. But you have Jesus who's bringing about peace, where the gods of the Greco-Romans only brought about chaos. It was constantly stressful being a believer in these pagan gods. But Jesus healed the rift that was between man and Yahweh. Reminds me of a story some time ago that an elder was telling me. He was at part of an eldership, and there was a dispute in the eldership, and two good friends that had been friends for many, many years had a falling out. They saw an issue. They both took different sides of it, and it got a little heated. Some words were said that should not have been said, and they kind of turned on one another, and they got upset with each other, and they stopped talking. Well, this elder realized this could not happen, and to keep the peace within the congregation and harmony within the eldership. So he decided one day, he called up one of the friends and says, hey, I want to come and talk to you about what happened with you and this other elder in the meeting, and just wanted to get, your thoughts on that, and we need to discuss this. And he was happy to do it. He probably wanted to say his case. He was probably frustrated. And so he picked him up in his truck. As he was driving, he ends up driving over to the other elder's house. And the friend's like, what are you doing? He goes, well, we're going in there. We're going to pick him up. And he goes in. He picks up this other elder. He has all these guys in the truck. He's driving. They're all sitting next to each other. This is super awkward. This is very tense. But he's doing this, and he drives them to a field. And he gets out of the truck, and as he gets out of the truck, he says, work it out. So these two guys that were at enmity with one another sit there, and they work out their differences. He comes back into the truck, and the guys have found peace. Jesus comes to earth, and he helps create peace between God and man. Because of this, he is preeminent. He is the one that holds it all together. He has created it, and he sustains it. And so when Paul is giving the overview, or when he is writing the book of Colossians, the whole point of the book is that Jesus is God. He is superior to all other spiritual entities. And he is the one and the only one who has brought about peace between man and God. That is the point of the book of Colossians. Thank you guys so much for joining. It was good to be with you, even from Castle Rock, Colorado, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about this excellent book about the preeminence of Jesus Christ. Thank you very much.